Hi, welcome back to another Le Mans Ultimate video. This week, we're going to be talking about multi-class racing, asking, do you have the right multi-class mentality? Now, disclaimer, before we go ahead, I should make it very clear that these are just my opinions from my experience, not only of racing in Le Mans Ultimate over the last few weeks, but also of sim racing in general and the experience I've had over the, oh my goodness, almost 3 decades of sim racing. Should also make it very clear that this is completely subjective, open to discussion. I most definitely am not an expert on the subject. It's just some of the things that I've observed, some of the things that I think about, and some of the things I think perhaps we as sim racers should talk about. And what are we talking about? Because love it or hate it, multi-class racing is one of the most exciting categories, one of the most fulfilling race experiences that you can have online or even an offline session. However, it can be as frustrating and dissatisfying in equal measures if it doesn't go right. All this week, as I've been racing, whether it's in the fixed GTE or in the intermediate GTE sprints or even in the weekly races, 2 songs have been playing in my head non-stop on repeat rotation. 50 Cent's Love It or Hate It, and There's a Thin Line Between Love and Hate. For this video, I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective of a GT racer. So we are usually the slowest category on track. However, this applies to any multi-class category. It doesn't have to be GTs and prototypes. It can be anything where there is a disparity between the engine size or power and the levels of downforce available to the respective classes. Any multi-class grid, you have a multifaceted makeup of cars, drivers, and performance envelopes. Before the green flag drops or the start lights go out, there is this combination of strategy, mentality, skill spectrums, experience ranges, preparation, mentality, whether it's aggressive or passive, and objectives for the race, whether someone is looking ahead on attack mode or over their shoulder with a defensive posture of, I am here for the safety rating. There are just so many variables at play that you really need to have given some thought before you join a multi-class grid. So let's talk about it. One of the things I firmly believe is important when you join a multi-class grid is to have some experience of how all of the cars in each of the categories perform on the track that you are racing. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go and spend hundreds of hours in each car, but it's really advantageous to know how the highest performing cars, so the fastest with the highest levels of downforce, perform in the braking zone, acceleration zone, through the slow, medium and high speed corners compared to the slowest cars, because there's a huge difference. If we assume that everybody in every car in every class has the best of intentions at heart, we can assume that things going wrong are the result of mistakes, misjudgments, and misunderstandings. Having some awareness of the performance profile of the fastest category of car, the secondary category of car, and the third slowest category of car, especially in Le Mans Ultimate, will help give you a bit more information when you're positioning your car on track, when you're approaching a braking zone, when you're turning into the apex, or when you're accelerating off the apex in and amongst traffic. And I say especially in Le Mans Ultimate because the physics in Le Mans Ultimate, especially the way that the tyres behave when cold coming out of the pits or coming off the start line, really makes a difference about how each car in the categories behaves. Le Mans Ultimate is most definitely not the game where you just rock up with 0 laps of practice, jump into a pickup race, join the grid and think that you're successfully going to make it into and out of turn 1 without a high possibility of causing chaos. Not knowing, having the experience through practice, building up some muscle memory, that the hypercars have a particular performance envelope, that on cold tyres they need care and consideration going into the first braking zone, The same with the LMP2 prototypes, the way that both they and the hypercars can swap 180 degrees on you if you lock up the rear tyres, and the fact that the GT cars on cold tyres, cold front tyres especially, will wash and understeer into turn 1 if you don't pay attention is a recipe for disaster. And assuming everybody makes it out of turn 1, lap 1 safely and in one piece, once the tyres have warmed up, once racing is underway, you really do need to understand that the different cars with the different downforce profiles have different performance characteristics through those slow, medium and high speed turns. The LMDH and LMDs are kings of the road when it comes to those medium to high speed turns. With the amount of downforce they put down, they pretty much suck up the track and run on rails. They have so much scope to take alternate lines through them because they have downforce for days. However, just like a high performance jet, they were not built to drive slowly. So through the slower turns, they have a much more cumbersome performance profile, something that usually results in them throwing out the anchors into a turn like a hairpin and pretty much being a mobile chicane until they can get up and running again. However, flip that on its head, when it comes to the GT cars, even though they have front splitters and rear diffusers and have much more downforce than a regular daily driver, when it comes to the low speed turns, they're quite comfortable. Medium speed to high speed turns, they are on the edge of their performance envelope. Drivers of the GT cars do not have numerous lines that they can choose from to go through those corners or those sequence of turns. So when a high-speed prototype approaches them, they really need to be conscious of the fact that trying to jump out of the way, which they shouldn't be doing anyway, for a GT car is a recipe for disaster. They will possibly break their downforce profile or step out by inducing a changing weight in the car and end up torpedoing themselves off the track. And this is where the element of psychology plays a huge role. When you consider that everybody who takes to the grid is here to compete, whether you're actually aiming for the win or just for a good result, no one wants to just turn up and just pootle around just taking in the scenery. Everybody has an element of an aggressive posture when they're about to take the start. But that aggression, that posture, has a spectrum. You have the absolute alpha mentality of take no prisoners. This is my opportunity to make up as many places and positions as possible because my opponents are right here, my competitors are in front of me, and everybody is just warming up. If I don't take the places off them now, they might warm up, get into their groove, and perhaps drive away from me. So now's the time to pounce. You then have the complete opposite end of the scale, those who come to the grid with a modicum of anxiety. I don't want to make a mistake, I don't want to fluff my star, I don't want to get a penalty for, I don't know, being out of line, I really don't want to shunt somebody, and really I don't want to do anything stupid. I just want to survive turn 1 and then see how my race pans out. Because the thing we need to be conscious of is on a multi-class grid, so in Le Mans Ultimate, if it's 2 categories or 3 categories, when there are 2 categories, you have those psychologies on the grid in duplicate. When it's a 3 category race, it's triplicate, because in each category you have the hyper aggressive, hyper defensive mentalities on the grid. You have the fastest prototype wanting to win the race into turn 1. You have the slowest prototype wanting to ensure that they don't get overtaken by an LMP2 and that they certainly don't rock up to the grid behind GTEs, and they definitely don't want to get to or leave turn 1 behind the slower categories. You then take it to the second category, so again a 2-category grid. You have the LMP2s, you again have the hyper aggressive at the front. I want to win. I certainly would like to pick off one of those slower LMDH or LMD cars, and I definitely don't want to be behind the fastest GTE. You then have the slower, less prepared, less confident LMP2s who perhaps have turned up to the grid and didn't even set a qualifying time, and unfortunately Le Mans Ultimate doesn't grid in classes, so they might start on the grid around the GTEs, behind the faster GTEs. So they have both a defensive and aggressive mindset at the same time. You then have the GTE category where again you have the fastest drivers at the front, aggressive, don't want to trip over the slowest LMP2, don't want to lose position to second, third or fourth place GTUs who too want to make up that position into turn 1, and most definitely don't want to do something stupid that means they leave the track, turn 1, lap 1 and end up at the back of the field. It's a minefield! And just when you thought that was precarious enough, throw into the mix the LMP2, or maybe even it's a hypercar who didn't set a time, rocked up to the grid late, is starting last behind the GTEs, who wants to come rocking up through the field off the green into turn 1 and clear the entire GTE field. Forgetting cold tyres, locks up the rears, turns 180 degrees and like a skittle knocks GTE cars flying into turn 1. And the most unfortunate thing about that is obviously that driver doesn't do it on purpose. They want to have a good race too. They're excited about their prospects, but unfortunately either lack of skill, lack of preparation, lack of composure, or lack of time means that they unfortunately destroyed the race of the fastest GTE drivers who were going for the win. Again, let me pause for a moment because this is not a critique, event, a rage against anybody. This is just, let's talk about this topic. What are your thoughts? What are your opinions? What are your experiences? What's your advice? Let's just talk about it. Because, confession, disclaimer, I know that when I joined the grid in a GTE car, I have a completely different mindset to when I joined the grid in a prototype. It literally is like a completely different persona comes over me. I can only describe it akin to that different psyche that you bring to the race when you're driving online against real life competitors, or you're driving offline against their AI. Whereas in that scenario of online or AI, you take a different risk tolerance into the race because you know the AI aren't going to start spamming flame chat at you, but you get a little bit more aggressive, ambitious, because you know you're not really disrupting anybody else's race other than your own if you get it wrong. Whereas in an online race, there's a lot more respect for the other competitors. We're not going to talk about the trolls. We're going to focus on everybody else who came with the best of intentions to the grid to have a good race. You take more care. You have a lower risk tolerance. But that isn't what's happening when I'm in a GT or I'm in a prototype. What happens is, I know that in a GT, it has a certain downforce profile, speed profile, traction profile, compared to the prototype that is all about the high speed, high downforce, and when you get it into that regime, the car comes alive. So you want to keep it there. You're impatient, you like going fast, you want to get to the apex, you want to load up the downforce, and you want to maximize your exit. You don't have time to be messing around behind a GTE losing time. In contrast, when I'm in the GTE, I'm very aware that in the low speed, the car's fine. In the medium to high speed, I need to have got the apex entry right. Otherwise, I'm going to track out off the track. I also need to ensure that I don't break traction in the medium to high speed because I don't have much time or grip to recover the car if it goes wrong. I'm going to fly off the track. When you then add into that in the multi-class environment, in the GT car, you're not only looking forward, you're looking behind you. You're approaching a corner, a turn, a high-speed apex, trying to make sure you line up the car, get the balance right, looking ahead, whilst also looking in your mirror before you turn in, because you know a high-speed prototype, whether it's an LMD, LMDH, or the LMP2, may well be fast approaching at a much higher top speed, coming in with much more downforce, expecting me in the GTE to vanish, disappear, get out of their way. Because when you're in the prototype, you are always in a hurry. And I say you, referencing myself. I can't speak for other people other than the evidence of my own experiences is that that appears to be what happens to many prototype drivers as well. You're in a race with another prototype, you don't want to lose time, especially in the low speed corners, because that is not where your car thrives. You want to be medium to high speed and you want to get there quickly. Whereas in the GTE, you just don't want the prototype to mess up your race because you're racing as well and you can't afford to give up your line in a medium or high speed turn, and you most definitely get impatient sitting waiting for the prototype to get up to speed coming off the low speed turns. Again, I say, it's a minefield. And then when you put all of that together, you have to then remember that in each category, in each car within the category, is a driver who comes to the grid with their own levels of experience in the car, experience of the track, experience of multi-class racing, experience of the conditions. And no two drivers are the same, no two drivers will react the same. So there's a hell of a lot of anticipation going on and strategic thinking. And this again is where I say, when we come to the grid in a multi-class race, we need to come prepared, especially if we're going to be in a race where we know it's going to be high stakes. If we're in a race and there are going to be one or two other categories, we know we're going to be in a position when we're going to be attacking, defending, or recovering. And as we're not talking to the other drivers in this race, the only means of communication that we have is the body language our cars project, the placement, the posture, how stable our car is when driving along, because that is what the other drivers are using as information to understand how they're going to race you, whether that's the same car in your category or the other categories. Your body language, your posture is all that they have to make a decision on. And then you're having to rely on the fact that they're going to be rational. And let's be honest, we're racing, there's adrenaline flowing. Rationale can go out the window. Which brings me back to my question, do you have a multi-class mentality? Because for me, approaching a multi-class race, I can come with a completely different level of confidence every single race. If it's the first race of the week, first race of the day, and I'm cold, my muscles are cold, my reflexes are cold, and I just am not up to speed, I've not been racing. If I don't do 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes of practice and warm up, and I just join the race with maybe 1 or 2 laps, I know I'm underprepared for that race. So my levels of confidence are already a percentile lower. I am going to give off hesitation in certain circumstances, and that hesitation is going to spread to the rest of the grid. For those of you that drive in real life and have a license or at least have taken lessons, you'll know that hesitation and anticipation make up part of the theory and practical exams, because they have consequences when you're on the road. When we're racing, not only does every second count, but every fraction of a second counts too. Whether it's our own decision making in accelerating, braking, applying steering input, avoiding another car on track, placing ourselves in a position to defend from attack or to attack the car ahead. All of those decisions are happening in microseconds. Throw in some hesitation and we're behind ourselves. If we then get behind ourselves, we then project a laggy message to the other cars on grid. They then have to make decisions based on information we're projecting that is delayed. We will then cause them to have an element of hesitation. They don't know what we're going to do, so it interferes with their anticipation, and then that's when cars collide. And again, if we think about the drivers in the slowest category who have the fast approaching, faster categories coming up behind them, especially when it's one who's thrown themselves off the track, lap 1, lap 2, lap 3, and are now very impatient, or those that didn't put in a qualifying time and started at the back of the grid, again, very impatient. They want to try and catch the back of their class before they get to lap 2, lap 3. That just breeds fear because you don't know how prepared that prototype driver is. So rather than looking forward, trying to focus on the GTE cars that you're trying to race ahead of you, you can't help but look over your shoulder, which again makes you hesitant, which means you're behind yourself, which means you're driving defensively rather than offensively, and you're again giving off a sense of vulnerability to the cars behind you. That's going to be the other cars in your class, the GT cars, who are going to sense it and are going to pounce. They're going to try and take a position off you. At the same time, that fast approaching prototype sees the squabble and thinks, yes, they're distracted, I can take them both, even if that means going off the track. And again, if they're not prepared or if they're hyper aggressive, recipe for disaster. When you throw into the mix the GT driver who has no idea what the performance profile or performance envelope of the prototype is like, or inversely, the prototype driver has no concept about what's going on inside the cockpit of the GTE car, placement of the car on track can be off. The LMP2 might pounce into an apex and put the GTE into a position on track that causes them to lose control, again ruining both races. Or the GTE might show the prototype one side of the car that they want them to pass on that really doesn't work for the prototype. So they might just dive to the other side of the car anyway. And if we're not on the same wavelength when that happens, chaos, calamity, disaster. So again, do you have a multi-class mentality? Do you come to the grid as prepared as you possibly could be? Again, no crime, no recrimination, no insults, no offense intended, no critique of anybody. It's a self-reflective moment. If you're involved in incidents in a multi-class category race, do you ask yourself, what could I have done differently? Was I actually as prepared as I could have been? Do I know what it feels like to drive an LMDH or an LMD or an LMP2 or a GTE around this track? Have I raced the car in these conditions, whether it's twilight, dusk, where it's daytime, whether it's night, whether it's in the rain? Am I as prepared, as I'm as knowledgeable about this race as I could be? And have I got empathy with the other cars on track who are trying to race their race? Am I thinking, rather than barreling into turn 1, ambivalent to everybody else, no care in the world, don't matter what the consequences are to the other cars if I make a mistake? Or is an element of, let me dial it down a bit, let me not try and take 10 tenths out of this turn, lap 1, turn 1, cold tyres in a car I'm not familiar with, and let's all get to lap 2. What are we doing? What are we thinking? What's our mentality when we take to the grid? And the reason I'm asking this question and opening up this debate is, again, because love it or hate it, multi-class racing is possibly the best category of racing that we can get to do online. Because when everybody does invest the time and effort to be as prepared physically as well as mentally for each race, it can be amazing, because you can get yourself into a position where you are so prepared that you are looking forward more than you're looking back. You are controlling your environment around you. You're projecting to the prototype when you're ready to be passed or not to be passed. You can signal to them, please don't try and take me here. This is not going to be good for both of us. Because whilst the prototype might be thinking, I don't want to lose half a second in this turn, it will really cost me a lot. that half a second might be a second or a second to a half if you slow down the GTE unnecessarily as well. So rather than diving in on the brakes, trying to take the apex, I call it stealing the apex, and then slowing down to a crawl, slowing both prototype and GTE down, losing a second each, why not think it through a little bit and actually think, where does my performance profile of my car reign supreme over the GTE? It's going to be on exit. It's going to be in the medium to high speed turns. So why don't I just wait, let the GTE navigate the hairpin, and then just drive past it on exit? Takes a little bit of thought, a little bit of consideration, and obviously needs to be a time when that doesn't open you up to attack from behind as well. But that's where we get to work together. And again, I'm saying this from the perspective of a GT or a GTE. But conversely, it's the same. If you're in the GTE, and again, you're as prepared as you could be. You're comfortable in the car, you're familiar with the track, and you understand the performance profile of the prototypes. You can choose where to seed the ground and make sure that you don't lose time or as much time, and that you don't make the prototype lose too much time either, because it will be paid back in spades. Because the other thing about multi-class racing, it's the same in single category racing as well, but definitely multi-class racing, is everyone has a long memory. You will remember how you were treated, whether or not there was patience, whether there was courtesy, whether there was etiquette, or whether or not somebody ruined your race, or at least the lap. Because that's going to determine whether you are compliant, whether you are cooperative, or whether you're the most stubborn car on track when that prototype comes around to lap you again. Or when you're the prototype, whether you're going to be even more impatient and just steal the apex, because the GTE was just so unhelpful racing against nobody. Oh, before I start rambling on and waffling for the next eternity, what do you think? What are your thoughts? What are your experiences of multi-class? What are the lessons that you've learned? What are the mistakes that you've perhaps made? What are the things you would suggest people do ahead of taking to the grid? And have you ever been in that position where you have to admit to yourself at least that, yeah, I was underprepared. I caused that problem. If I were to do this again, I would do X, Y, and Z. What is X, Y, and Z? So yeah, do you have a multi-class mentality? And what does that mean to you? Let me know in the comments. If this video gave you something to think about, if it was something that you liked, you want to see more, a share, a like, a subscribe would be appreciated. But most importantly, yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let's get the conversation started. And with that, let's go. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for all the support.